Charlie Green sat still, his calm gaze meeting the officer's hardened stare. He slowly reached into his pocket, pulling out his worn military ID and placing it on the table. The officer glanced at it, his sneer deepening, clearly unimpressed. "A vet, huh?" the officer muttered, as if the very idea annoyed him. Without another word, he spat just beside Charlie's chair, a clear insult. Charlie's jaw tightened, but he held his composure, refusing to give the officer the reaction he wanted. "You got a problem, officer?" Charlie asked, voice steady. "Yeah, the problem's you," the officer snapped, reaching down to pull Charlie up by the arm. "We don't need people like you hanging around here." Before Charlie could respond, the officer dragged him outside, slapping cuffs on him without hesitation. A few people inside the diner glanced up but quickly looked away, not wanting to get involved. As they reached the patrol car, another vehicle pulled up beside them, its doors swinging open. A tall young man in a sharp suit stepped out, a look of intense fury on his face. It was Marcus, Charlie's son, and he moved toward the officer with unwavering authority. "Uncuff him." "Now," Marcus ordered, his tone firm and commanding. The officer sneered. "And who exactly do you think you are?" Marcus held up his badge, an unmistakable FBI emblem glinting in the sunlight. "Special Agent Marcus Green, and this man you're harassing is my father." The officer's face drained of color as he realized the weight of his mistake. Marcus stepped forward, his voice now a cold, cutting whisper. "I'll be filing a formal report. Expect to hear from Internal Affairs." The officer fumbled with the cuffs, his hands shaking as he released Charlie. Charlie stood tall, brushing off his sleeves, and gave his son a proud, grateful nod. As the officer slinked back, Marcus placed a reassuring hand on his father's shoulder. "Let's get that coffee, Dad," Marcus said, guiding him back inside. This time, no one dared to look away. Charlie's gaze didn't falter as he replied calmly, "I earned that ID, officer. Same as any other veteran." The officer, Stark, let out a derisive laugh. "Earned it? Don't make me laugh," he sneered, tossing the ID back onto the table as if it were trash. "You think that piece of plastic makes you welcome here?" Charlie gripped his coffee mug tightly, feeling the weight of the room's attention but keeping his composure. "I'm just here for a cup of coffee," he said steadily. "I'm not causing anyone trouble." "Trouble's exactly what follows folks like you," Stark spat, his voice barely above a whisper. "You think you can just walk in, sit wherever you like? That you belong here?" Charlie glanced at his watch, hoping his son would arrive soon, though he knew better than to expect Stark would back down. "Maybe I'll wait right here," he replied, his voice unwavering. Stark's expression darkened, his face mere inches from Charlie's. "You think you've got a right to sit here, don't you?" he growled. "Rights are earned, old man. And I don't buy for a second that you earned yours." Charlie met his eyes with a steady look. "Believe what you want. I know what I've done, and I know who I am." Just then, the chime of the diner door broke the tension. Charlie turned to see his son, Marcus, walking in, his expression stern as he took in the scene. Stark sneered, unbothered by the newcomer. "Can I help you?" Stark barked. Marcus held up his FBI badge without a word. "You can let go of my father," he said coldly. Stark's face went pale, his smug look vanishing as he recognized the badge's authority. He released Charlie, stepping back in shock as Marcus placed a reassuring hand on his father's shoulder. "We'll be filing a report," Marcus said, his tone icy. Stark stammered, but Marcus ignored him, guiding his father back to their table as the rest of the diner looked on in silence. Charlie looked at his son with a proud smile, knowing that today, justice had spoken louder than any words. Without warning, Stark leaned forward, his eyes filled with contempt, and shoved Charlie's shoulder, nearly knocking him back in his seat. The diner grew silent as patrons froze, their eyes locked on the scene, but no one dared to intervene. "You don't belong here," Stark hissed. "People like you always think they're untouchable, hiding behind some fake story." Charlie straightened, his expression calm but firm. "I'm not hiding behind anything, officer. I'm a veteran. I served just like plenty of others, and I've come here today for a cup of coffee with my son. Nothing more." "Your son?" Stark scoffed, rolling his eyes. "Another story, I bet." But as he sneered, The door chimed again. Charlie looked up, a flicker of relief crossing his face as his son Marcus entered the diner, his gaze quickly taking in the scene. Marcus's stance was authoritative, and his sharp, professional attire stood in stark contrast to the officer's demeanor. Without a word, Marcus reached into his jacket and produced his badge, flashing it for all to see, a gleaming symbol of the FBI. The room fell even quieter, and Stark's smug expression wavered, his confidence crumbling as he processed who Marcus was. "Officer Stark," Marcus said, his voice calm but laced with authority, "you're going to step back from my father right now." Stark blinked, stammering, his bravado slipping away. I didn't know he was your father." "It shouldn't matter," Marcus replied icily. "The way you've treated him today will be reported. Expect an investigation." With his face flushed, Stark quickly backed away, stumbling over his words. Marcus ignored him, focusing on Charlie, who stood tall, a proud gleam in his eyes. "Let's go, Dad," Marcus said softly, guiding him toward the exit. As they left the diner, Charlie glanced back, meeting Stark's stunned gaze with a quiet strength. Today, respect and dignity had won, against even the harshest of hate. The diner was dead silent as Stark pulled Charlie up, twisting his arms behind him with a brutal force that made even the onlookers flinch. The metallic click of the handcuffs echoed, punctuating the tension in the room. Charlie held his ground, his face calm, defiant, and unwavering. "You don't belong here," Stark sneered, his voice low and seething. "You think you're something special? A washed-up vet, coming in here like you have any right to sit among us?" Charlie looked Stark squarely in the eyes, unshaken. "I don't need your permission to be here," he replied, each word steady and deliberate. "And this badge doesn't give you the right to decide who belongs and who doesn't." Stark's grip tightened. "Big talk, old man. Let's see if you're still so brave when you're sitting in a cell." But just as Stark began to haul him toward the door, it swung open. Marcus, Charlie's son, stepped in, his eyes scanning the room and instantly locking onto his father, restrained and humiliated. Marcus's face hardened as he took in the scene, his presence commanding attention. "Unhand him," Marcus said firmly, his voice carrying an authority that froze Stark in his tracks. Stark scoffed, attempting to maintain his tough facade. "Who do you think you are, barging in here like that?" Marcus reached into his jacket, flashing his FBI badge for all to see, the familiar insignia shining under the fluorescent lights. Stark's face paled as the realization set in, his grip on Charlie loosening. "This man is my father," Marcus said, his tone cold and unyielding. "And I'll be reporting every word, every action, every abuse you just showed him." Stark stammered, his earlier confidence gone, scrambling for an excuse. But Marcus didn't give him the chance, stepping forward to unlock the handcuffs and help his father steady himself. The silent patrons watched, some visibly relieved, others ashamed for not having intervened. Charlie stood tall beside his son, meeting Stark's gaze one last time, his voice calm yet piercing. "Respect isn't demanded, officer. It's earned." With that, Marcus guided Charlie out of the diner, leaving Stark standing there, exposed and defeated. As justice had finally spoken louder than his hatred, Charlie looked down at the stains spreading on his coat, feeling a surge of anger rise within him. But instead of lashing out, he lifted his head, his gaze cutting through Stark with a cold, unwavering resolve. "You think that makes you powerful, don't you?" Charlie said, his voice a low growl. "Spitting on a man, trying to humiliate him. But all it shows is weakness." Stark sneered, his face contorting in fury. "Weakness? You're the one in cuffs, old man. You're done." Charlie straightened, facing him squarely despite the cuffs. "I've faced men who knew real strength," he said, his tone steely. "Men who fought for something, who knew the value of respect. You don't have an ounce of it." Stark's face flushed red, and he moved closer, his voice dropping to a venomous whisper. "Respect? People like you don't get respect. You get what you're given." But before he could shove Charlie toward the car, a voice rang out. "Unhand him. Right now." Both men turned to see Marcus, Charlie's son, standing tall, his badge visible for all to see. The FBI emblem glinted under the streetlight, casting a sharp contrast between the authority Marcus represented and the bully Stark had become. Stark's face paled and he stammered, suddenly unsure of himself. I didn't know. You didn't know? Marcus's voice was cold, each word laced with authority. What you should know is that I'm filing a report for every second of this abuse. This man you're treating like trash is my father. Stark's hand dropped from Charlie's arm, his confidence deflating as the gravity of his actions settled in. He took a step back, struggling to find words, but Marcus didn't give him the chance. Now, unlock those cuffs, Marcus commanded, his gaze piercing. Stark obeyed, fumbling with the keys as he released Charlie's wrists, his hands shaking. Charlie flexed his hands, regaining his composure, and looked up at his son with pride. Marcus placed a steadying hand on his father's shoulder, guiding him away from Stark, who stood paralyzed with shame and fear. As father and son walked away, Charlie turned back one last time, his voice steady and unbroken. Real respect isn't forced. It's earned. And with that, they left Stark behind, his power and pride stripped away for all to see. In the back seat, Charlie sat tall, his eyes burning with defiance as he met Stark's glare in the rearview mirror. The officer's face twisted in rage, his hands clenching the steering wheel so hard his knuckles whitened. Stark's silence only confirmed what Charlie suspected. Beneath that badge and bluster was a man terrified of his own insignificance. "You can throw me in every cell in this city," Charlie said, his voice unwavering, cutting through the silence like a blade. "But it won't change who you are. You'll still be a man hiding behind a badge, terrified that people will see the truth." Stark's jaw tightened, but he kept his gaze on the road, his anger boiling just beneath the surface. He didn't dare speak, he didn't dare meet Charlie's eyes. For the first time, he felt exposed, stripped of the power he'd wielded so recklessly. Charlie continued, his voice calm but filled with iron. "I may be cuffed back here, but at least I know who I am. I don't need a uniform to feel like I matter. I earn my respect. You're just borrowing yours." The words struck Stark like a punch, and his grip on the wheel faltered. He swallowed hard, rage mingling with a flicker of doubt that he couldn't shake. As they approached the station, Stark struggled to regain his composure, but Charlie's words echoed in his mind. He glanced in the mirror, catching sight of Charlie's steady, unbroken stare, a gaze that saw through him, through every layer of bravado he'd built around himself. In that moment, Stark felt small, exposed in a way he'd never imagined. And for the first time, he felt a crack in the shield he'd always worn, the badge that was supposed to give him power, but now felt like a burden too heavy to bear. As they pulled up to the station, Stark's hands shook, and for the first time in his career, he wondered if the man in cuffs behind him had more strength than he could ever hope to have. Stark's face contorted with rage, his grip on the bars tightening as he took a step closer to the cell. "You don't know anything about respect," he spat, his voice thick with venom. "Respect is something you earn, not something you demand just because you've been around a little longer than most." Charlie stood unmoving, his gaze unwavering as he met Stark's eyes. "Respect doesn't come from intimidation or fear," he said, his voice calm but filled with a quiet strength. "It's earned through dignity, through standing up for what's right, not by throwing your weight around and hurting people who can't fight back." Stark's sneer deepened, his fists clenched so tightly his knuckles turned white. "You think you're better than me, don't you? Just because you wore a uniform once. You think you've earned something? You haven't earned anything. You're nothing now." Charlie's eyes narrowed, the anger in his chest simmering, but he held his ground. "I earn my respect in the battlefield, and I don't need to prove it to someone like you." His voice dropped lower, each word deliberate, cutting through the officer's rage. "You're a man in a uniform who's too afraid to look in the mirror and see the coward behind the badge." The silence between them grew thick, Stark's breath ragged as his fury rose, but Charlie stood unshaken. "You've got your power now, Stark, but it won't last. It never does. Men like you, hiding behind badges, always fall the hardest when the truth catches up." For a long moment, Stark said nothing. His face, red with anger, flickered with something else. A brief glimpse of doubt, a crack in his armor. He quickly shook it off, trying to reclaim his composure. "Enjoy your time in here," he growled, his voice now colder. "Maybe you'll finally learn some respect." Charlie didn't flinch. He'd faced worse. He'd endured more than this. "I've already learned what I need to know," he said softly, his words lingering in the air long after Stark had stormed away. "And it's not respect I'm missing." The sound of Stark's footsteps faded as he retreated down the hall, but Charlie's eyes remained fixed on the bars, his resolve stronger than ever. He wasn't broken. He wasn't afraid. The fight had only just begun, that his chest burning brighter with each passing second. The weight of the years he'd spent serving his country, the battles he'd fought and survived, now gave him strength. He wasn't just a man in a cell, he was a veteran who had earned his place, his respect, through sacrifice. The clang of the cell door echoed in his mind, a reminder of the man on the other side. Stark thought he had won, that he had broken Charlie, but he was wrong. Charlie wasn't broken. The officer had underestimated him, just like many before him. As the minutes ticked by, Charlie's thoughts turned to Marcus, his son. He knew his boy was out there somewhere, and that was the thought that anchored him. The world was watching, and Marcus would make sure Stark knew the truth. Charlie knew his time would come. Stark may have been able to lock him away for now, but the officer couldn't lock away the truth. Soon enough, the walls would come crashing down on him. Justice had a way of finding those who thought they could escape it. Sitting there, in that cold, harsh cell, Charlie knew that this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. When Marcus arrived, Stark's world would change. The scales of justice always tip, even when the weight of the world seems against you. Charlie stood from the bench, the fire still burning in his chest. He had faced worse, and he would face whatever came next. Stark would have his day. And Charlie would be there when it came, standing tall, ready to make sure the truth was heard that turned a simple situation into a power trip. A man in a diner, minding his business, wasn't the problem. "You are." Stark stood frozen, his mouth slightly open but no words coming out. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't expected Marcus Green, a decorated officer, the very one whose reputation he thought he could tarnish, to arrive with such fury. Marcus' eyes narrowed, his expression hardening with every word he spoke. "You want to talk about respect, Stark? Respect is earned. Not through intimidation, not through abusing authority. You don't get to walk around here like you're above everyone else, especially not when it's my father you're treating like dirt. You're lucky I'm not pressing charges against you right now." Stark flinched as though struck. The color drained from his face completely as he struggled to keep his composure. "I didn't know it was your father, Captain," he muttered, his voice weak now. He was causing a scene." "A scene?" Marcus interrupted, his voice rising. "A man sitting at a table having coffee was causing a scene? You're either lying or you're just that deluded. And I don't care which one it is." He stepped closer to Stark, lowering his voice but letting the venom seep into every syllable. "You don't get to treat people like this, especially not my father, and get away with it. You may have that badge, but you don't own the world. And you sure as hell don't own him." The hallway fell silent, all eyes on the confrontation unfolding. Stark opened his mouth but no words came. The reality of the situation was sinking in. This wasn't just any old man. This was the father of Marcus Green, a man who knew how to make things right, who commanded respect not through force, but through his principles. "I'm taking my father out of here," Marcus said, his voice steady but firm. "And you're going to face the consequences of your actions. Trust me, Stark, this is far from over." Turning toward the cell, Marcus unlocked the door and stepped inside, his eyes softening as he approached Charlie. "Dad, we're leaving," Marcus said quietly, his gaze meeting Charlie's with an unspoken understanding. Charlie nodded, his posture straight, the calm in his demeanor unshaken by the events. "Let's go, son." As the door swung open, Stark didn't say a word. He stood motionless, watching as Marcus and Charlie walked out, leaving him to face the fallout of his own actions. The weight of his mistake pressed heavily on him, but it was too late now. Marcus had made sure that Stark would no longer be able to hide behind his badge. Charlie had earned something much more valuable than respect. He had earned his place, his voice, and his integrity. That you did was abuse your power. What you did was personal, and it was wrong. You chose to violate my father's dignity because you thought you could get away with it. This wasn't just one mistake, It was a pattern of behavior. And it's not something I can overlook. Stark's face twisted in desperation, but Marcus wasn't moved. You think because you've worn that badge for years it means you're entitled to treat people however you want. But it doesn't. All it means is you're entrusted to serve and protect, not bully those you deem inferior, Marcus continued, his voice steady, but with an edge of contempt. You have no right to use that badge to degrade people. Stark shifted uncomfortably, his earlier bravado gone. His voice faltered. Captain, I never wanted to hurt anyone, I just thought. Marcus stepped even closer, his eyes locked onto Stark's, unwavering. No, you didn't think. You acted on your ego, on your assumptions. And now you'll have to answer for it. The silence between them grew heavy as Stark opened his mouth several times, trying to find the right words, but they all seemed inadequate. His face reddened, humiliation sweeping over him. Marcus didn't give him the chance to continue, his resolve unshaken. You'll be suspended while this is investigated. And don't even think about trying to cover this up. The witnesses have already spoken. Marcus paused, his eyes cold. You can pretend all you want that this is just a one-time mistake. But it's not. And you'll answer for every single one of them. Stark stood frozen, unable to form a reply, his chest heaving as the weight of his actions settled in. Marcus didn't give him a second more. You're dismissed, Officer Stark. Don't come back here unless you've learned what respect actually means. With that, Marcus turned and walked toward Charlie, his father's quiet figure still holding his ground in the stark, cold cell. There was no victory in Marcus' expression, only a quiet determination that justice would prevail, and that the law would never be used as a shield for abuse. Dad, let's go home, Marcus said, his voice softening as he unlocked the cell door. Charlie nodded, his posture never faltering. He had been through far worse than this. And this moment, this fight, would never be forgotten. As father and son stepped out of the station together, Marcus' thoughts were clear. Stark's reckoning had just begun. And no matter how far this man tried to hide behind his badge, the truth would always catch up with him. Actions. But it's not the badge that defines a man. It's his integrity, his respect for others. Stark lost both the moment he decided to abuse his authority. Marcus clenched his fists, still clearly angry, but he nodded in agreement. He's not getting away with this, Dad. Not now. Not ever. I'll make sure of it. Charlie looked at his son, pride swelling in his chest. I know you will. But you've got to remember, Marcus, that there are good people out there too. People who respect the badge for what it's supposed to stand for. And it's up to men like you to make sure that the ones who misuse it are held accountable. Marcus sighed, the weight of his responsibility heavy on his shoulders. I can't stand the thought of what you went through, Dad. I can't believe someone would stoop that low. But I'll make sure this doesn't go unnoticed. You have my word. Charlie gave him a firm, reassuring pat on the back. I trust you, son. But remember, it's not just about him. It's about all of us. The ones who don't get the respect they deserve. The ones who can't speak for themselves. What happened to me, what Stark did, it was a reminder. We all need to stand up for each other. Especially when we can. Marcus exhaled slowly, his anger slowly subsiding as he looked into his father's eyes. You're right. And that's what I'm going to do. For anyone who has to deal with this kind of treatment. It's not over yet. The two stood in the quiet corner for a few more moments, taking in the weight of the situation. Finally, Marcus gave his father a small, determined nod. Let's go home, Dad, he said. Charlie smiled, the fire in his heart still burning. Lead the way, son. Together, they walked away from the station, their bonds stronger than ever, knowing that justice had started to take its course, and that the fight for respect was far from over. Incident warrants such a review. Officer Green was being difficult, and I was only doing my job. I acted within the parameters of protocol to maintain order. Marcus's gaze never wavered. He leaned forward slightly, his voice cold and controlled. You weren't maintaining order, Officer Stark. You were escalating the situation. You disrespected a man who served this country, who fought for the rights you now abuse. And you crossed a line that can't be undone. Stark shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his fingers gripping the edge of the table. With all due respect, sir, I was just trying to do what I thought was right under the circumstances." "He wouldn't cooperate," the internal affairs representative interrupted, her voice firm. "We have reviewed all the evidence, including witness testimonies, and it is clear that Officer Stark's actions were not justified. Not only did he physically manhandle Mr. Green, but he also violated the department's core values of respect and professionalism." Stark's face flushed with humiliation, and he opened his mouth to protest, but the internal affairs representative continued. "We've also reviewed his history with the department, and there have been several complaints filed against Officer Stark for similar conduct. Today's review is not just about this incident, but about a pattern of behavior." Marcus's eyes remained fixed on Stark, his voice unwavering. "You failed to see my father as a man. You failed to show him the basic human dignity that we all deserve. And because of that, I'm going to make sure you face the consequences." The room was silent as Stark's bravado crumbled. He seemed to shrink before the eyes of the officers and staff present. The internal affairs representative turned to the rest of the room. "It is clear that Officer Stark has violated both departmental policies and the trust of the community. We recommend his termination effective immediately." Stark's face went pale as the words hit him. He opened his mouth as if to argue but found no words. His shoulders sagged, and for the first time, he truly seemed small. Marcus remained calm, but his gaze was hard, his voice cutting through the tension. "This isn't just about one man, Stark. This is about every person who has been mistreated, who has been belittled, who has been forced to endure because of the badge you wear. Today, you answer for that?" The internal affairs representative nodded, and the decision was made. Stark's fate had been sealed. As the room began to clear, Marcus turned to his father, who had been quietly watching the proceedings from the side. Charlie gave his son a look of quiet pride. "You did the right thing, Marcus. This wasn't just about today. It's about changing the culture, making sure something like this never happens again." Marcus nodded, a weight lifting from his shoulders. "We'll keep fighting, Dad. For respect. For justice." The two of them stood together, side by side, knowing that they had done what was right. It wasn't just about one officer, it was about a larger fight for accountability, dignity, and respect for all. And as they walked out of the room, the bond between father and son was stronger than ever, forged in the fires of justice and humiliate a man who did nothing but exist. This wasn't a slip-up or an accident. This was a deliberate act of cruelty. You chose to abuse your position, to treat a civilian like an enemy because you didn't like what he represented. You don't get to walk away from that. Stark's face reddened with frustration, but he remained silent, unable to defend himself. The weight of Marcus's words hung heavily in the air. The internal affairs representative spoke again, her voice firm and impartial. "Officer Stark, your actions are being reviewed by this department, and the witnesses' accounts leave no room for ambiguity. If found guilty of misconduct, you will face the consequences of your actions." Stark slumped in his seat, his earlier confidence completely gone. His shoulders hunched as if the weight of his own decisions was too much to bear. Marcus didn't back down. "You thought your badge gave you the right to treat people like garbage. But your badge is supposed to stand for something. Respect, integrity, the rule of law. You violated all of that in one afternoon. And now you're going to answer for it?" The room fell silent, the officers around them reflecting on the seriousness of the charges. Stark had been a part of the department for years, but the respect he once commanded was now gone, replaced with contempt and disbelief. The internal affairs representative glanced at the officers around the table, making eye contact with each of them. "We will be conducting a full review of Officer Stark's actions. The evidence will be examined thoroughly, and if these accusations are substantiated, we will move forward with appropriate disciplinary measures." Stark's voice faltered as he tried one last time to defend himself. "I didn't mean for it to escalate this far. I never intended to hurt him." Marcus's cold gaze remained fixed on him. "You didn't have to escalate it at all. You chose to, Stark. Every action you took was intentional, and now you're going to face the consequences." With the room still heavy with the weight of Marcus's words, the internal affairs representative nodded to conclude the review. "We will proceed with the investigation. Officer Stark, you are dismissed for now." Stark slowly stood, his face a mixture of anger, humiliation, and fear. As he exited the room, he knew the walls were closing in on him, his career and reputation crumbling under the weight of his actions. Marcus, though visibly angry, remained calm as he turned to face his father, who had been silently observing the proceedings. The bond between them was stronger than ever, forged not only by blood but by a shared commitment to justice. "You did the right thing, Marcus," Charlie said softly, his voice filled with pride. Marcus nodded, his expression hardening once more. "I had to. It's not just about what happened today. It's about setting a standard, making sure something like this never happens again." Together, they walked out of the room, knowing that the battle wasn't over. But for now, they had done what was right, and that was enough. Charlie nodded, his face reflecting a quiet understanding, though there was no joy in his expression. "It had to be done," he said simply, his voice steady. Marcus looked at his father, a weight in his chest that wasn't just from the review but from the emotional toll the entire ordeal had taken. "I wasn't sure how it would go, but I couldn't let it slide. People need to know that abuse of power has consequences." "I know you did the right thing," Charlie replied, his gaze meeting Marcus's. "But it doesn't make it any easier, does it?" Marcus shook his head, a slight frown crossing his face. "No, it doesn't. I didn't want it to come to this, but it had to. For him, for the community, and for everyone who's ever been treated the way he treated you." Charlie's gaze softened. "You've done more than enough, son. Not just today, but in everything you do. You stood up for what's right, even when it was hard. That's something to be proud of." Marcus exhaled slowly, the tension easing from his shoulders. "I just hope the lesson sticks. No one should be treated the way he treated you. Not now, not ever." Charlie placed a hand on his son's shoulder, a gesture of reassurance. "Well, Marcus, you've shown them the right way. You can't change the past, but you can make sure the future's different." The two men sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the day slowly lifting, replaced by a quiet sense of resolve. Whatever the future held, Marcus knew they'd face it together, guided by the principles of justice and respect, his father deepening. "You're right," he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "I can't imagine what it's been like for you, living with that every day. But you've always stood tall, no matter what." Charlie smiled faintly, a small but powerful gesture. "That's what they don't understand, Marcus. The way they try to break you, to make you feel like you're less than you are, it's all a test. A test of who you are when they try to strip away your dignity. You don't let them win. You never let them win." Marcus looked out into the night, his mind swirling with the weight of the conversation. "I wish it was easier, Dad. I wish people didn't have to fight for their place, for their right to just exist without being judged. But I see now, it's more than just surviving. It's about making sure the next generation doesn't have to fight the same fight." Charlie nodded, his gaze thoughtful. "Exactly. It's about making a difference, even if it's small. Every day. It's about showing people what respect really means. Not just the word, but the action behind it." A moment of silence passed between them, filled only by the soft night sounds. Finally, Marcus spoke again, his voice quieter but filled with conviction. "I won't let you down, Dad. I won't let anyone down. Not again." Charlie reached over, placing his hand on his son's shoulder, his grip firm and reassuring. "I know you won't. You've already proven who you are. And you've made a difference today. Remember that." The two sat together in silence, their bond stronger than ever, not just as father and son, but as two men fighting for the same cause: respect, justice, and dignity. Whatever battles lay ahead, they knew they'd face them side by side. The night stretched on, the stars shining like silent witnesses to the promise Marcus had made, to carry on the fight for justice, dignity, and respect. He sat beside his father, feeling a sense of resolve growing within him. The road ahead was long and filled with challenges, but he wasn't alone. Not anymore. His father's wisdom and strength, the lessons of resilience and unwavering conviction, had shaped him into the man he was. And now, as they sat together in the quiet of the evening, Marcus knew that his fight was not just his own. It was shared by every person who had ever been silenced, overlooked, or made to feel less than. It was a fight for the future, for a world where no one would ever have to feel that way again. As the cool night air embraced them, Marcus squeezed his father's shoulder, a silent promise passing between them. "We'll keep fighting, Dad. For everyone." Charlie's smile, though faint, was full of understanding. "That's all we can do, son. Keep fighting. Keep showing them what's right." And with that, the two men sat in the stillness, knowing the battle was far from over, but also knowing without a doubt that they were ready for whatever came next. Here's a suspenseful ending with a call to action. The night stretched on, the stars shining like silent witnesses to the promise Marcus had made to carry on the fight for justice, dignity, and respect. He sat beside his father, feeling a sense of resolve growing within him. The road ahead was long and filled with challenges, but he wasn't alone. Not anymore. His father's wisdom and strength, the lessons of resilience and unwavering conviction, had shaped him into the man he was. And now, as they sat together in the quiet of the evening, Marcus knew that his fight was not just his own. It was shared by every person who had ever been silenced, overlooked, or made to feel less than. It was a fight for the future, for a world where no one would ever have to feel that way again. As the cool night air embraced them, Marcus squeezed his father's shoulder, a silent promise passing between them. "We'll keep fighting, Dad. For everyone." Charlie's smile, though faint, was full of understanding. "That's all we can do, son. Keep fighting. Keep showing them what's right." Will justice continue to prevail? Can the fight for respect and dignity change the future? We want to hear your thoughts. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories of courage, resilience, and the pursuit of justice. Together, we can make a difference.